The Holy One God. Amen. The news has felt especially bleak lately. I don't know about you, but it has to me. Protracted war in Europe, wildfires and hurricanes ravaging our planet, a seemingly never-ending string of ex-presidential indictments. Turning on the television or opening a web browser right now feels a little bit like reading from the Book of Revelation. We're living strange times, friends. And it is hard sometimes to find hope. Hard to begin to imagine a way out of this mess we've landed ourselves in. So often, when we are hurting, finding a way out of the suffering is all we can think of. And understandably, right? Who wants to suffer a minute longer than we have to? But today's readings invite us to pause our frantic search for the exit sign. The scriptures we just heard speak of a God who dwells with us in extraordinary and improbable ways, right in the heart of our suffering. God doesn't just stand on the outskirts of our pain and beckon us towards a brighter future. God first joins us right in the heart of the hell we find ourselves in, and then, and only then, shows us the path to deliverance. In the book of Exodus, we hear of Moses' encounter with God in the desert in the form of a bush that burns but is not consumed. What an extraordinary image. It is hard, it's really hard for us to conceptualize a fire that burns but doesn't consume, because consumption is at the very heart of what fire is. I've seen the devastation that wildfires wrought in California. Deep scars etched into the hillsides, entire city blocks reduced to rubble. Fire is greedy and indiscriminate in its consumption. Or at least normal fire is. The divine fire that Moses encounters is different. It burns not to consume, but to illuminate, not to destroy, but to create something new. It is a divine manifestation so commanding and so extraordinary that it stops Moses in his tracks and rewrites his entire life. Moses cannot unsee what he saw in the desert. And the holy ground upon which he stands transforms his very being. He goes from hiding in the wilderness to boldly confronting the powers of oppression, even though he's not super keen on the idea at first. I don't actually know that Moses stops being afraid, but empowered by that divine flame, he knows that there is no going back, because he knows that the God who is what is and will be what will be is with him. The burning bush leads Moses right into the heart of his people's suffering. He has to join them in the despair of their enslavement before he can lead them out of it. And we see that same dynamic at work in today's gospel, where Jesus boldly and unapologetically acknowledges the suffering that is to come for him upon the cross. Peter tries frantically to avoid it, and Jesus, in no uncertain terms, tells him that it's impossible. The Son of Man must suffer, not because God arbitrarily delights in suffering, but because a God who doesn't freely join us in our suffering is not a God who is particularly useful to us. And we, Christ's followers, are instructed to pick up our own crosses, not because God is punishing us, but because it is only when we face the enormity of what is broken within and around us that we can encounter the redeeming grace Christ offers. I want to linger for just a moment on this instruction to pick up our cross, because it is so often used in harmful and frankly toxic ways. So let's be clear. Picking up our cross does not mean staying in abusive relationships because we think God wants us to. Picking up our cross does not mean silently and stoically suffering when we find ourselves oppressed in any way. In fact, picking up our cross has very little to do with us at all. The cross that Jesus picks up is not his own private list of grievances and woes. It is the suffering and the world. And so picking up our cross means doing what Jesus did, standing in solidarity with others, even when that comes at a cost. And above all, picking up our cross means choosing a future that leads to resurrection, because the cross is never, ever the end of the story. This week, I have been interpreting these two scriptures, the fire that burns but doesn't consume, and the cross we are instructed to pick up through the lens of our migrant ministry that we undertake with our Better Together partners. It is so easy to turn a blind eye to the stream of South and Central American migrants who have been seeking asylum from oppressive regimes. For the most part, Libertyville and the surrounding communities are not places where these migrants come, where we see a whole lot of migrants, at least not from the most recent wave. Unless we make a conscious effort to seek it out, the migrant crisis is not a day-to-day reality for most of us. But like Moses and the burning bush, once we see the enormity of the situation, we cannot unsee it. Just a few dozen miles to the south of us, the city of Chicago is in crisis. There are not enough resources. There is not enough space to house the thousands, at most recent count, 13,000 this year alone, asylum seekers who have either come to Chicago voluntarily or been brought here from other less hospitable cities. Families are herded into school gyms and police stations, where they sleep in overcrowded and inhumane conditions. And single men are offered no such luxury. They are sent to the streets because there is no room for them. Social service agencies are completely underwater. The courts are backed up beyond hope, and getting a lawyer at all is harder than finding a needle in the proverbial haystack because there just aren't enough. Meanwhile, a little closer to home, what started out as 9 Venezuelan asylum seekers, who we welcomed to the Trinity Highland Park Rectory in January, has mushroomed to 16 people living in a single-family home, because the need is just that desperate. By all accounts, these 16 are the lucky ones. And even so, what they have been through and what lies ahead of them is beyond what any of us can easily comprehend. I've spent a fair bit of time down there. Sorry, frog in my throat. I've spent time down there translating, because that's what I can do. And every time I walk out of that rectory, I cannot help but think that this is our cross to bear. Not their cross, our cross. We cannot stand idly by while our fellow humans live in such need. Why? Because the same fire that drew Moses' attention in the Egyptian wilderness thousands of years ago still burns in our hearts today. The same fire that compelled Moses to do something about his people's enslavement by Pharaoh urges us to take action against all forms of oppression. And it is that same fire that burned in Jesus' heart when he instructed his disciples to pick up their cross and follow him. Follow him not into the pointless suffering that leads to death, but into the redemptive suffering that leads to resurrection. That fire compels us toward a new future, a future where every chain is broken and no cross is borne alone. There are so many ways to help, friends. Our migrant ministry can use your time, your connections, your social capital, and yes, your money. In just a few minutes, we'll be taking up a special collection to support this ministry, and I urge you, I invite you to give as generously as you are able, and to get involved however you can. Bottom line, friends, an encounter with the living God does not leave us unchanged. Once we have seen the Holy One, we cannot unsee it. There's no telling where the road will take us, but we will never walk it alone. And so, fellow travelers, may the same flame that drew Moses' gaze in the wilderness burn brightly within us, burn but not consume. ways.